Kestral Gaian is a storyteller, a queer storyteller, at a time when queer stories, queer voices, are cast as dangerous, purveyors of a radical ideology that blurs the traditional boundaries of gender identity and sexual expression. And it's true that this thoughtful, soft-spoken Brit is, in a decidedly understated manner, changing the narrative, crafting characters, stories, even alternate universes that are familiar yet radically different, where the past and present collide, where life and death are states of mind, where love is love. Softness, Gaian writes, feels like a form of resistance. Stories should leave a mark, not a scar. I'm David Hunt. I sat down with Kestral Gaian recently, shortly after the release of their newest book, The Boy from Elsewhere, a young adult novel that combines time travel, alternate realities, and an ancient bloodline, and includes queer characters and a same-sex romance. I asked Gaian about the audience they write for.
In terms of the fiction books that I write for a mainly young adult audience, although I write for young adult and upwards. I think young adult fiction that is aimed at sort of 13 or 14 plus is actually really at its best when it is also accessible for adults who want a lighter read. The world is such a difficult place to live in right now for everyone. And, sometimes grown-ups, sometimes the adults want to break from that and to read something a bit more entertaining and a bit easier to engage with and a bit easier to digest. So I suppose in terms of the fiction that I write, it is for teenagers and young adults and adults who are looking for some escapism that is a little bit less heavy duty than reading Tolkien, for example. As much as I love reading Tolkien, there's a time and a place. But I do write other things as well. I write poetry, which has a kind of broad adult audience mostly, and do some writing in and around theatre. That's mostly aimed at adults as well. So broad set of audiences for the stuff that I do. But I find young adult fiction writing so much more fun because it's an audience that doesn't tolerate being patronized in any way. But it is an audience that is broad and diverse and just so fun to write for.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I'm not a consumer of young adult fiction. And so I didn't know what to expect when I read your books. And then I was sort of flummoxed. I was like, I love this book. What does that say about me? Am I just young at heart, or is there something universal about the writing?
I think good young adult fiction is quite universal. I think young adult just means it's a bit of an odd label, really. It just means accessible fiction. And I don't think you have to be young at heart, or I don't think there has to be any kind of shame in adult readers wanting something that's accessible to read now and then. I think it's such an interesting place we've got ourselves into, in the same way that, poetry scholars are very gatekeepy around poetry and who can enjoy it and how they should enjoy it and those kind of things. We've got ourselves into this kind of place in the world where we say, no, grown-ups should read difficult books. Books should be hard to get through. Books should make you think. Books should, you should take 3 months to read a book. And actually, sometimes it's nice to have something that's more accessible, and there shouldn't be any shame around that at all. It should just be another thing that people can enjoy.
In a way, I think literature courses in school sort of ruin literature for a lot of us. If you take a poetry class in high school, you never want to read poetry ever again in your life. And then you go to a poetry reading in a club and you're like, wait, this is different than what I experienced in school.
No, I agree with that. I studied music and it made me want to never do it professionally because it was just sort of, I loved it. But now, whenever I listen to anything, my enjoyment is ruined so much. But, I find myself analyzing and over analyzing everything I listen to. And that I think takes something away from it. And I think I studied and was taught to kind of go into the technical instead of go into the emotion of a piece.
And so people listening who haven't read your books, I don't want to leave the impression that the books are necessarily all about fun and adventure. I mean, there's a lot of hidden lives, for example. There's some dark spots in there in both your books that I read, Hidden Lives and The Boy from Elsewhere. How do you weave that complexity into a story so that it's not so that it's balanced? I guess is what the word I'm looking for.
I think authenticity is really important to me and really important to a mature audience as well. I think having to suspend disbelief kind of to the nth degree to make a story work doesn't really sit well with me. And so adding in complexity and that kind of depth to characters just is because that's my experience of dealing with people in real life and in the real world. People are messy and complicated, and as much as there's fun and action and adventure, everyone is has a side to them that is quiet and has a side to them that is pensive and has a side to them that is thinking and churning away in the background. And I think trying to bring that out in the characters to make them as rounded as I can in my books, but just naturally then lends itself to, there's the fun, there's the adventure, there's humor in places, but it's real and people are dealing with things and, you know, nothing really gets resolved quickly in our lives. So it shouldn't get resolved quickly on the page either.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the teacher in Hidden Lives, who's kind of a jerk through parts of it, but is also struggling with his own issues. So, well done, I guess, in terms of authenticity, because we all can relate to authority figures that are flawed.
I think it's also really difficult when we are not getting what we need or what we want from people to think that might be because they've got something going on in their lives rather than because it's something we're doing. And I think it's really important to write characters like that who are flawed, who are multi-layered, because no villain in a story or no annoying character in a story is annoying in isolation. Those things come from somewhere.
And the family dynamics seem real to me in both of the books of yours that I read. In The Boy from Elsewhere, the mom's a great mom, but it's not all sweetness and light. I mean, there's been some grief in that family as well, and talk about those characters and developing those characters.
I think family for me is a really important thing to talk about because every person you meet is some influenced by their family, whether directly or indirectly. No matter how much contact we have with them or don't have with them, our families are part of our histories. They're part of what makes us who we are. In many ways, they're what give us our values and our traumas. In many ways, some of our very deep seated insecurities come from family interactions, and that I think is a great thing to explore in character development. Having family members to interact with who are in themselves complex and flawed just adds this layer of depth, I think, to being able to tell the audience, to tell the reader who a character is.
So your new book, The Boy from Elsewhere, when people ask you that haven't read it, ask you about it, how do you describe that book in a sort of the elevator speech, I guess, fashion?
Oh, so it's very genre bending, which I have been very intentional about. So people say, "Oh, what's your book about?" I say, "Well, it's a sci-fi fantasy romance story, sort of. A boy wakes up on a beach with no idea how he got there and meets someone else and they decide to help them and end up on this adventure, kind of gathering friends and family around them and end up saving the world. And it's as random and as kind of unusual in its development as that. Like, we learn what's going on as the characters do, and we see kind of glimpses into the pasts of various different characters through a few sort of diary entries and things like that that throw back. But ultimately, the book is about coming together, celebrating differences, helping each other, lifting each other up, and then becoming greater than the sum of our parts in the service of something huge.
And so you craft the story by telling it from different points of view, from different times even. The time sort of is, it's very fluid.
Yes, and so this book is the first book in a series as well. So there are many things in the first book that I have deliberately included and left dangling because that's a much bigger thread in book two or book three as a three-part series. And so it's been really fun actually writing a book knowing that it's part of a series, because that is giving me the opportunity to introduce concepts but not have to resolve that until later, which I think has proven interesting in the feedback I've been getting from readers. I've had more than a dozen messages pop into various inboxes online from people that have just said, "How dare you end on a cliffhanger? I want to know. I want a resolution to all these things," which is, of course, coming. But I like the fact that I haven't had to tie up every loose end by the end of book one.
Is that difficult to keep track of as you're writing this? You must have it diagrammed at some point.
I have so many notes. So I have, because obviously this is a series of books, I have a series Bible that is a currently like 40-page document that is all the kind of the lore, the continuity, the things to keep track of, timelines, all of that kind of thing. Maps even as well, which are all useful for things coming up in the next two books in the series. But I do frequently find myself having to consult timeline diagrams and kind of character journey arc diagrams and things that I have, because they are all dealing with their own things and also how their own things are impacting each other in the group, and then how that kind of has an impact on their journey in the kind of bigger picture and in the bigger scheme of things. And I mean, it's so much fun to basically kind of create these characters and give them a kind of basic personality and set of rules, and then kind of throw these situations at them and see, okay, well, how would this character react to that? And how does this character react to that character reacting to that? And it's like a giant game of The Sims, basically. It's fantastic.
So you can do anything because you're the author. Do you impose some constraints on yourself, or are you like William Burroughs, anything goes?
Well, a little bit of both. I think I try not to force a character to do something that doesn't feel right for the character. But at the same time, people can surprise you, and I want my characters to be able to surprise the audience and to surprise me as well. You know, the characters do have a bit of a life of their own. Once you've created them and they start down these journeys, sometimes they do take you in unexpected places. And I try and sit with that, and I try and let that happen. I want to try and be as anything goes about it as I can be. But every now and then something will come up, and I think actually if we follow that path to its logical conclusion, I think that character ends up in a place that isn't natural for them and that isn't true to kind of how they were written. And I think it's really important to kind of to have that check and balance in there.
Sort of like a game of chess. I mean, you need to sort of figure out where the pieces are going, and if you pull one off the board, it can it come back? I don't know.
Yeah, having to be kind of 5 or 6 moves ahead at any given time as well, to make sure that you're not about to checkmate yourself into an uncomfortable ending for a character.
Now, is this considered the? I hear people talk about the mini worlds genre of sort of fantasy writing. Is that what this is?
I think in part, yes. It's, I think a lot of the kind of many worlds stories or kind of multiverse stories, or however you want to say it, focus on that as the overriding kind of core of the story. In this story, and certainly in this series, it's very much secondary. It's, yes, there are different worlds in these stories, but that's not the core of the story. The core of the story is essentially how it's essentially how people can become either good or less good depending on what they're doing. It's basically like how do we live in this world without becoming evil? Essentially, is the crux of the story. The fact that there are multiple worlds is more a device than it is a main point of the story. So I think it certainly sits in that genre, but it's not a kind of forfeit in that genre, which is why often people have described my work as kind of as bending genres, and I'm okay with that. I think, as a person, I don't love to put myself into little boxes, and so my stories don't fit neatly into boxes either.
Some of your young characters seem wise beyond their years, uh, and I think that in a lot of ways contradicts the prevailing media narrative about the Generation Z as being sort of clueless or being overly sheltered. Um, why did you choose to make your young characters, sort of resilient and wise? I mean, was that a conscious choice, or is that something that's reflected in your experiences with young people?
Yeah, I mean, they're there because they're based largely on real people. Particularly Ellie in this most recent book, who is 13 and just so resilient and strong-minded and clever, is based on a young person that I know. It's the daughter of someone that I've worked with, and that these people absolutely exist in their kind of strong-willed glory, and I think it's really important to show that there are people like that in the world, and that young people aren't all growing up in this kind of content infused nightmare. That some people are continuing to just grow up and be brilliant and unique in themselves. And that does echo a lot of my experience growing up as well. I think, yeah, I'm autistic, and growing up in that world of being an autistic LGBTQ plus young person at a time when none of those things were really talked about was an interesting experience. And I have seen the confidence of newer generations growing up without some of the same restraints. And I think actually writing those characters is really important. And writing characters that are role models that I would have needed when I was that age as well is really important.
Yeah, you write on your website about growing up in a home where there wasn't a lot of money, um, and growing up as a queer kid. You write about feeling a sense of difference and having a deep desire for connection with others, and that certainly informs your writing. How would it not?
Absolutely. I think ultimately, writers bring so much of themselves to any story, as do readers. I mean, the second a story is out there in the world, it is read through the lens of the reader. So every different person that reads something that I've written will come to it with a different set of expectations, a different set of experiences in life. And, I can only hope that the experiences that I have had that bleed through into the writing vibe well with the experiences that other people have had as they start to read the writing.
You're listening to Tell Me, David, Queer Stories Past and Present. I'm David Hunt, continuing my conversation with storyteller Kestral Gaian. Yeah, it occurs to me that being a queer kid today, perhaps easier than when you and I were younger, but still is fraught. These are difficult times especially for trans kids and non-binary kids. What's your experience in talking to young people as you go around promoting your book and other work that you do with young people? What do you hear from them about this time?
So I certainly would never use the word easier to describe how it is for young queer people growing up now. Difference, certainly. I have done a lot of youth work and continue to go out and do voluntary work in the youth sector. And I think it is such an interesting time for LGBTQ plus young people because there is such a stigma in the world still, and so many of the same things that were being said about lesbian and gay people in the 90s is being said about trans people in the media now. You have this added social media frenzy that makes everything so much more visible, so much louder. And there is an almost sort of deafening amount of dissent towards people just being who they are that any queer young people has to deal with on a daily basis, essentially. And many are faced with the choice of, do I interact with the world in the same way that my peers do, or do I have to shut off from some of those things so that I can protect myself? And that's such a sad choice that people have to make, essentially limiting their own engagement in the world as it is in order to not face kind of harassment and discrimination online. But I think, there are still escapes for people. They look different. There are youth groups. There are fantastic, places for people to go. There are great online communities as well. And I think that level of visibility is better than it was, or certainly a lot different to how it was when I was growing up. And, I felt like I was the only queer person in the world. Now queer young people know that they're not the only queer person in the world, but unfortunately they get visibility of all of that hate and vitriol alongside it.
So I'm guessing you grew up in a time before the internet. You're a millennial, I guess.
Yes. So when I was growing up, there was no internet. There was a law in place in the UK that forbade schools and other organizations from even acknowledging the existence of queer people. So it was a very silencing time. There was no research, there were no resources, there was no ability to just go and, you couldn't Google anything, you couldn't go to the library and look it up, you couldn't ask a teacher about it because they weren't allowed to answer the questions. So it was a very different time. Now you have knowledge, but you also have knowledge of all the hate. Then you didn't have any knowledge at all.
And how did you navigate that?
It was difficult. I had relatively liberal, sort of open-minded parents. So while I grew up in a small town, they were still very vocal in their support of people and their differences. We were getting kind of little bits and pieces on television of kind of positive representation here and there, although a lot of it was still very negative in the media. But so I knew that people like me existed. I just thought I wasn't. I thought I was the only one in my town. I thought I was the only one in my county, let alone anything else. And it was just very isolating. There was no one to talk to. There was nothing to do. Eventually we got dial-up internet when I was about 16 or 17, and that was a game changer. Because I was able to go online and look in forums and on websites to see that there were people out there like me, which was a really incredible thing, and just so freeing to realize that there was life beyond my little town and my little view of things, which was really, really cool. And then, eventually, as I was getting towards leaving school, I was sort of nearly 18. I found out that there was someone else who was queer in my school, so it was suddenly I wasn't feeling quite so alone. But all of that, I mean, was so drawn out compared to how it is now.
Was there a time when you thought you wouldn't make it?
Certainly, in many ways, thinking about kind of early years of queer identity, thinking about what do I do? Do I leave this tiny town that I grew up in? All of those kind of things. And then thinking about how do I deal with feelings around sexuality and also gender identity and things like that. There were many times I couldn't see. It was less than I didn't think I was making, more than I couldn't see a future. I couldn't see how I would get to anywhere that I wanted to be. And, I had dreams and I had no idea. I had couldn't even conceive a path towards them, which was, looking back on that, it's quite a difficult thing to have gone through because now, I am very able to look at kind of goals and dreams that I have and think, right, that's how I get there. Brilliant. And it's difficult to think that there was a time that that's not the case.
You edited, I guess, a book on Section 28, which you alluded to, which was, can you tell me about that? Tell me about that law and about your efforts to document those times.
So Section 28 was a law in the UK from 1988 through to 2003. And it was essentially a don't say gay law. It forbade the promotion of homosexuality or similar things as a supposed lifestyle. It was a very insidious wording, but essentially it meant that any agency responsible for dealing with young people, whether it was a school or your doctor's office or anything like that, couldn't even acknowledge that homosexuality or LGBTQ plus identities were a thing. There were threats of teachers losing jobs, schools being shut down, doctors being fined, all of that kind of thing. So it instantly silenced people, the people that we needed in our lives. I mean, I remember asking my science teacher once about it, and I asked her because it felt like she would be a safe person to ask, and I think she would have been, because her answer, she looked at me with very sad eyes, and she said to me, "I'm so sorry, I can't answer this question. I'll lose my job." And it wasn't even that. It wasn't a difficult question. It was just like, so something around that, how many gay people are there or something like that. And she couldn't say. And I think growing up, the difficult thing about Section 28 is that because nobody talked about it, nobody knew who they were. Nobody had that kind of, oh yeah, here's the language I can use to define me. But we also didn't know why it was so difficult. So it wasn't until I was an adult and I learned what Section 28 was, and I realized there were other people that were going through exactly the same struggle as I had because of the silencing effect of Section 28. And so the book 28 was really a way of being able to bring people together who have this shared experience of this silencing without even knowing it was happening, to kind of talk about their perspective of it and tell those stories. So I was very keen that the book had people from a mix of ages, a mix of backgrounds, but all who were impacted by Section 28.
Can you tell me a story of one of those that sort of sticks with you from the book?
One of the most poignant stories from the book was actually of a gay teacher at the time. So John Campbell, he contributed to the book stories of being a gay teacher in the 90s, and everything was fine until he was more honest and open about who he was at work. And suddenly, because of Section 28, all anti-discrimination laws were out the window. And he was able to, he was told that any bad behavior was his own fault. And, if there was a student that was misbehaving, it was probably down to him. He got put on, academic probation and things more often than he ever should have been, all because they, were looking for ways to try and fire him and get rid of him because, they didn't think that parents would want to be taught, would want their kids to be taught by a gay teacher and these kind of things. And so it wasn't just impacting the young people, it was impacting, everyone involved in education and healthcare at the time, which is such a shame. And one of the other stories from Owen Jones was about the fact that there were a whole group of people who were at school just after the repeal of Section 28. And of course, the law changed, but there wasn't new guidance for schools on how to do anything better. They just repealed the law. And so nothing really changed for a long time in schools. Everyone was still operating as if the law was still there because they hadn't been given any guidance of what had changed and what was new and how they could move forward. So it was a really long shadow, as I describe it, to that particular piece of legislation.
It's the idea of silencing voices. As a storyteller, that must really be offensive, the idea that you're not allowed to talk.
It's one of the things that's driven me to spend so much of my life telling stories, and really why it became more of a vocation, more of a calling than it did a hobby. I think when you realize that you've been silenced and you didn't even realize you were being silenced, the desire to kind of counter that, to go against that, to be noisy in a way is really strong. And for me, a way of doing that is to tell stories, to tell authentic stories, to tell stories that I wouldn't have been able to tell otherwise. And people often ask me, why do all of your books have queer characters in them? And it's, well, because actually, my life is full of queer characters, brilliant queer characters, but so often and so many points in history, these people would have been silenced to the extent that they wouldn't have appeared in a story, or their authors wouldn't have been able to tell that story. So I'm going to tell them that this is my way of rebelling in a way.
And then I also wanted to ask you about Tubelines, which I haven't read, unfortunately, but that's queer poetry about the London Underground, which just sounds like an kind of odd but also interesting project.
Well, one of my favorite pastimes, and I think probably many writers are the same, is people watching. I absolutely love just sitting in a space and watching the people interact with each other and be by themselves and how they take up space. And while I was living in London, I kind of got into this habit of sitting on the London Underground for longer than I needed to. I would use it to get to places, but I'd quite often give myself a bit more time, and I'd go on a couple of extra stops and double back and just sort of see the different things that occurred on the tube. And I started making notes about that because it was really fascinating to me. And those notes kind of evolved into poetry. And I've always used poetry as a way of kind of understanding the world. It's part of my sort of autistic processing of things, is that poetry helps me to try and make sense of the world around me. And so I suddenly realized that I had this whole, I had hundreds. We managed to whittle them down to 50 for a collection of poems. But I just had hundreds of poems and, missives and little quips and quirky things about what I was seeing when I was sat on the London Underground. And so it became this collection of lines from the tube, or tube lines, all about just the people and the experiences of the tube. I mean, some of them are about my experience on the London Underground. So I've written there are a couple of poems in there about train stations and things like that. But a lot of them are just about, here's this person wearing this shirt. What does that mean? Or here are these people that are just looking at each other funny. What does that mean? And it was just a way of me kind of processing and understanding the world, and ended up growing into this collection of poems.
Do you have one there accessible that you could read, perhaps a short one?
So this is a poem called All the Things I Have Done, which I wrote whilst sat on a train station platform, just sort of musing about life. I'm perched here on the platform, watching people wait. They're all waiting for something while I sit and contemplate. There's coffee in my paper cup and a buzzing in my brain as I struggle to find meaning between the northbound trains. Pulling out my notepad, I write out what I feel. Is anything original? Is any of this real? You see, I realize all the things I've done, many others have done too, some with more precision and some with a better view. I've said things I thought clever, then I heard them in a song. I've tried to write what's honest, then I found I sang along. I've danced like I was flying, then seen it on TV. I've cried beneath the cherry trees like every poet's plea. Nothing is original, but maybe that's okay. I'm just a spark inside a storm that just started yesterday. We copy, shape, and echo. We mimic, blend, and build. We're stories made from others, recycled, stitched, refilled. I've laughed in ways I thought were mine, but Romeo's been there. I've grieved in quiet corners with Alden in the air. I told a joke, then heard it told in a better way with flair, and still it made me laugh again, like it was always there. All the things I've done, the borrowed and the blue, are part of something older that still feels brave and new. Because in this great mosaic of life, of rhythm, love, and rhyme, we're not here to be the first, we're just here to be this time. People flood the platform as rush hour takes shape. I was feeling uneasy. Now my thoughts start to escape. I finish off my coffee and let out a heavy sigh. Who cares if I'm original? At least I tried.
So do you feel part of this great queer movement going back into history? Is that part of what that's about?
Oh, that's a. I think if I said yes to that question, I'd probably feel like I was a bit of a narcissist. So I think I certainly feel part of an incredible community of queer people and queer creatives who put things out into the world. And hopefully those things resonate with people, whether now or in, 10 or 50 or 100 years. I mean, I would love for people to still be reading my things in 100 years' time. Um, and I certainly feel not so much connected, but indebted to and incredibly grateful for all of the incredible queer creatives that have gone before me. I think there is a huge legacy of LGBTQ plus creativity, and you look back through the years of pioneering trailblazers in all walks of life and in all kind of fields of creativity, and all of them have given me something. They've all given me an ability to speak the way that I speak, to do the things that I do. They've given me courage and confidence, and they've given the world so much kind of rich, incredible heritage that I'm incredibly grateful for.
And you are in many ways your own creation. Even your name, I take it, is something that you created yourself. Do you feel does that empower you in some way, that the idea of defining yourself for yourself in this crazy world?
I think there's a lot of power in being able to say, this is who I am, this is who I want to be, and this is the person I'm going to be and the way that I'm going to live my life. And that's what I've tried to do. I think I acknowledge the fact that people change and grow and evolve, every day, let alone every year. And I don't ever want to kind of be the same person for the rest of my life. But being able to define who I am and what I do and say, this is the life I want to have and strive towards that has been really powerful. And I think particularly as that, I think back to that queer kid in the small town, not even knowing if there are other people in the world like them, and not knowing if they would ever, not being able to see that they would ever be able to fulfill any of their dreams, their aspirations, their hopes. It is a powerful act in the face of that start in life to be able to say, I am going to do these things. I am the person that I want to be, and this is what I'm striving towards.
Yeah, I covered the AIDS epidemic for a public radio station in California in the early 1980s, and almost everyone that I interviewed back then is gone. But I often think of those folks and what they would think of you and me today, 45 years later, and what we have made of ourselves in the world. That gives me some hope that we're living the life that in a lot of ways they didn't get to.
That particular crisis meant there were so many lives cut short, so many songs that didn't get written, so many books that didn't get created, so many lives that didn't get lived. And I think uh, choosing every time a queer person now chooses to live, chooses to fulfill their dreams, chooses to go out and make the life that they can dream of, that honors those people that didn't get to do that for themselves.
I think too they would be glad to see that there's still a spark of fight left in the community, that they really sort of pioneered, well, going all the way back into history. Being queer almost always meant a fight, and I think in a lot of ways young people today are carrying that forward and living that today.
I agree, and I think just the shared community celebration is important as well. One of my favorite quotes from height of the AIDS crisis was someone who said, "We burn our friends in the morning, we protest in the afternoon, and we dance in the night." And it's the dance that pulls us together and binds us and galvanizes us for the fight ahead. And I think that's really important to remember because there is such a fight and such a struggle for particularly for trans people at the moment. And, in many ways, LGBTQ plus laws and legislations are going backwards in parts of the world. And actually, yes, it's really important for us to keep fighting that, but it is really important for us to keep celebrating each other and lifting each other up and making sure that we're never putting everything we have at all times into a fight and that we take the time to feel queer joy as well.
You wrote a piece of music called "Birds and Humans," another creative outlet, I guess. And that was a joyful piece, I thought. Uh, Tell me about doing that.
Thank you. So Birds and Humans started out as a poem, and I have always been quite musical. I studied music, and I sang in a lot of choirs when I was younger. And the opportunity to work with a good friend of mine on turning one of my poems into a piece of music was too good to pass up. So it was just over a decade ago now, I created this choral piece of music. And the poem "Birds and Humans" was actually a lot about my name and the name that I had chosen. The fact that Kestral is a bird, and Gaian is from Gaia, which is very much kind of the earth. And so you've got these two worlds that kind of collide in my name, and actually they collide all around us all the time as well. We are not the only inhabitants of this planet, and actually, there are many different planes that people exist on in this planet, both above and below, as well as on the ground we're on. And the music itself was very powerful and full of kind of hope as well as reflection about this idea that we are not the only life form on this planet, and we are all on this planet kind of living together and learning together and growing together. And that gives me a lot of hope and feels very freeing to think about in a way as well.
What's next for you?
So I'm currently working on the next two books in the series, the Reality Quake series. Book one was The Boy from Elsewhere that has just come out. But obviously, as that book has just come out, I'm also traveling around at the moment, going to lots of events and doing writing workshops and book readings and things, not just in kind of shops, but also I'm going to a lot of LGBTQ plus youth groups and talking about getting into writing as a queer author and sharing the book and the story and the characters with them as well, which I think is a really important thing to be doing. So in and around that, the creativity is already in full swing for the next two books in the series. Kind of as full time as I can be creating those right now, and that's really exciting.
So, in this digital age, there's still space for a writer.
Absolutely, I think that now more than ever, uh, writers being who they are and being out in the world and talking to people and creating stories is important because I have spoken out a lot about my thoughts on AI and the kind of the joy that it takes from people being able to, experience the joy of learning, the joy of creating, all of those kind of things. But I think ultimately there are a lot of people that don't necessarily realize they are consuming a lot of AI generated content. So the more writers can get out there and share their stories and share the work that goes into kind of building these characters that people grow to love, the more people can spot the fact that that's not something that AI can do as well, and encourages them that to A, get into writing, and B, to really appreciate the art and craft of writing and the work that goes into telling those kind of stories.
And then how can people find you online?
So I have some social media. I'm on Instagram, kes.tr.al, where you'll find quite a lot of pictures of food, because I quite enjoy food. I can also be found on Blue Sky and on Mastodon using the same handles. But mostly these days via my website, so kestr.al, where I semi-regularly update a newsletter, and there's various bits of information around how to find me all through there.
Terrific. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap it up?
Just to say a huge thank you. I think it is so important, like I said, to keep talking about writing and about storytelling, and every opportunity to do so is wonderful. And podcasts, I think, are a fantastic way for people to digest this stuff. So I'm really pleased to have been here. Thanks very much for having me on.
Bleed my life up, 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 bleed my life up.
I'd like to thank Kestral Gaian for talking with me for this program. Check out their newest book, The Boy from Elsewhere, a young adult queer adventure that speaks to the young adult in all of us. For Tell Me David, I'm David Hunt.